November 20th, 1943, 09:15 hours. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Corporal Tadao Onuki, manning his Type 93 13mm heavy machine gun in Pillbox 47 on Red Beach 1, watched the American Higgins boats grind to a stop on the coral reef 500 yards offshore, exactly as Rear Admiral Shibasaki had promised. Then he saw machines that should not exist, tracked vehicles swimming through ocean water like steel crocodiles, crossing the reef barrier that had just stopped every conventional landing craft, their paddle tracks churning white foam as they climbed toward his position. His hands trembled on the gun's grip. Commander Shibasaki had briefed them 3 days ago. The Americans need 4 feet of water for their boats. The neap tide gives them 3. They will wade. They will die. The mathematics were perfect. Every pillbox, every Type 92 machine gun, every mortar had been pre-sighted for Marines struggling through chest-deep water for 30 minutes. Slow targets, certain death. But these machines, these swimming tanks, were moving at the speed of a running man, carrying 20 troops each, closing the distance in minutes instead of half an hour. How many bullets would it take to stop swimming steel? Onuki chambered his first round and prepared to find out. The answer to Corporal Onuki's question began 8 years earlier and 3,000 miles away, in a place that had nothing to do with war. 1935, Clearwater, Florida. Donald Roebling, heir to the Roebling fortune that built the Brooklyn Bridge, sat in his workshop sketching something the world had never seen. A rescue vehicle that could swim through the Florida Everglades shallow swamps and drive across dry land without stopping. Hurricane season had just killed dozens of people stranded in areas conventional boats couldn't reach and wheeled vehicles couldn't cross. Roebling's solution was radical. A tracked vehicle with aluminum hull and paddle track propulsion that moved through water at 6 miles per hour and across land at 12. He called it the Alligator. By 1937, his prototype was rescuing hurricane victims in waist-deep swamp water where nothing else could operate. The U.S. Marine Corps noticed in 1940, Major General Holland McTeer Smith, watching newsreel footage of Roebling's amphibious rescue vehicle, saw something his commanders had requested. For 20 years, a way to get Marines from ship to shore without stopping at the waterline. The military adaptation began immediately. Roebling's civilian rescue vehicle became the LVT-1 landing vehicle tracked. The aluminum hull became steel. The passenger compartment expanded to carry 20 combat-loaded Marines. The Continental W670-9A engine delivered 146 horsepower, pushing the 9-ton vehicle to 12 miles per hour on land and 6 in water. By 1941, 200 LVT-1s were produced for training. By 1943, an improved model, the LVT-2 Water Buffalo, featured a 250-horsepower Continental W970-9A engine, increased capacity to 24 troops, and could reach 20 miles per hour on land, 6.5 in water. The revolution in amphibious warfare had a name, swimming steel. But revolution meant nothing without a test, and Tarawa would be that test. The problem appeared in intelligence briefings weeks before the invasion. Betio Island sat behind a coral reef barrier extending 500 to 1,000 yards offshore. Conventional wisdom said American landing craft, the LCVP Higgins boats that had worked at Guadalcanal and Sicily, required a minimum water depth of 4 feet to clear their 3-foot aft draft and 2-foot 2-inch forward draft. Navy tide tables predicted 5 feet of water over Tarawa's Reef at H-hour 0830 on November 20th. Acceptable margins. Except Major Frank Holland, a New Zealand coast watcher who'd lived on Tarawa, warned planners about dodging tides, unpredictable neap tides that could drop water levels by 2 feet. If Holland was right, there would be only 3 feet of water over the reef. Higgins boats would ground out. Marines would wade 1,000 yards under fire. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the same officer who discovered Roebling's Alligator 3 years earlier, sent an urgent message to Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious task force. No LVTs, no operation. Smith demanded enough amphibious tractors to land the first 3 assault waves. Turner opposed the request. LVTs traveled aboard slow LST landing ships that could only make 8 knots versus the task force's 15. Using LSTs would delay the entire invasion convoy by days. Smith didn't budge. He'd run the calculations. Without LVTs, casualties would be catastrophic. Turner reluctantly approved. The scramble began. The 2nd Marine Division located 75 older LVT-1s and requisitioned 50 brand-new LVT-2s that had just arrived in the Pacific Theater. Total available, 125 amphibious tractors for an invasion force of 18,000 Marines. Not nearly enough, but sufficient for the critical first waves. There was one problem. The LVT-2s arrived the morning of departure with 0 crew training time. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, commanded by Major Henry C. Drews, would operate machines they'd never driven in combat they'd never experienced. And there was a second problem: armor. Or rather, the complete lack of it. LVTs had been designed as cargo carriers, not assault vehicles. Their steel hulls were thin enough that every weapon on Betio, from rifle bullets to 8-inch naval guns, could penetrate. In Samoa, before departure, Marine mechanics jury-rigged a solution. They welded 3/8-inch boilerplate to the LVT cabs, protecting drivers and gunners from small arms fire. The troop compartments remained exposed. It was improvised, inadequate, and all they had. November 19th, 1943, evening. The invasion fleet stood 12 miles off Betio. Major Drews moved among his battalion, checking the 125 LVTs staged on LST decks, engines, tracks, radios, ammunition for the .30 and .50 caliber machine guns mounted on improvised pedestals. Everything depended on untested technology operated by undertrained crews carrying inadequate armor into combat against the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific. Marines loaded belts of ammunition and tried not to think about swimming through ocean water in thin steel boxes, while 4,000 Japanese defenders aimed at them from concrete bunkers. At 0300 hours, November 20th, pre-invasion bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers hammered Betio with 14-inch and 8-inch shells. At 0830, the first wave of LVTs churned toward shore, 30 minutes late due to coordination delays. Behind them, Higgins boats carried the 2nd and 3rd waves. Everyone waited to see if Major Frank Holland's warning about dodging tides was right. At 0920, 500 yards from shore, the Higgins boats hit coral and stopped dead. Water depth, 3 feet. Holland had been right. Conventional landing craft couldn't cross, but the LVTs kept swimming. And Corporal Tadao Onuki, watching from Pillbox 47, opened fire. What those 125 LVTs were swimming toward was the most heavily fortified 2 miles of coral in the Pacific. Betio Island measured 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point, less than 1 square mile of sand, coral, and concrete. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had transformed it into a fortress that his superiors in Tokyo called Impregnable. He commanded 4,836 defenders, 1,497 elite troops from the Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force, Japan's equivalent to Marines, and 1,112 men from the 3rd Special Base Force. Construction battalions had worked 18 months building nearly 500 fortified positions connected by trenches and underground passages. Every pillbox featured concrete walls 4 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails and coconut logs, designed to withstand 14-inch naval shells. Overhead cover protected defenders from bombs and shrapnel. Multiple firing ports allowed interlocking fields of fire. Escape tunnels provided routes between positions. Shibasaki briefed his officers with mathematical confidence. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The arsenal justified his confidence. 4 8-inch Vickers naval rifles, purchased from Singapore in 1905 and mounted in reinforced concrete emplacements, could fire 200-pound shells 17 miles. These coastal defense guns had been specifically positioned to destroy American transport ships attempting to land troops. 14 Type 88 75mm dual-purpose guns covered the beaches and airfield. 40 Type 94 37mm anti-tank guns waited in concealed positions. Machine guns occupied every strategic point. Type 92 7.7mm heavy machine guns, firing 450 rounds per minute, positioned every 50 yards along the beach, each with interlocking fire zones designed to create kill zones in the shallow water. Type 93 13mm heavy machine guns, originally designed for anti-aircraft defense, had been repositioned to rake the reef approaches at 475 rounds per minute. Every weapon had been pre-sighted, every range calculated, every field of fire tested. The beach obstacles completed the defensive perfection. A log seawall constructed from coconut logs stood 4 feet high, running the length of the invasion beaches. Barbed wire stretched in multiple rows. Mines had been buried in the sand. Steel tetrahedrons, pyramid-shaped obstacles designed to rip the hulls of landing craft, dotted the shallows. Anti-boat obstacles, fashioned from palm logs and coral, jutted from the reef. Japanese engineers had calculated that conventional American landing craft would need to beach in water shallow enough for Marines to wade ashore. Every yard of that wading approach had been measured, marked, and covered by overlapping machine gun fire. 30 minutes of wading through chest-deep water under continuous fire. The mathematics were simple, 50% casualties minimum before reaching shore. But Shibasaki's greatest defensive asset wasn't concrete or steel, it was coral. The reef surrounding Betio extended 500 to 1,000 yards offshore, depending on location. American intelligence had identified this barrier months earlier. Landing craft needed a minimum of 4 feet of water depth to cross. Navy tide tables predicted 5 feet over the reef at H-hour on November 20th, acceptable margins. But Shibasaki knew what American planners had only been warned about: dodging tides. Unpredictable neap tides that struck the Gilbert Islands twice monthly, dropping water levels by 2 feet without warning. He'd watched these tides strand fishing boats on the reef dozens of times. If the dodging tide came on November 20th, American landing craft would ground out 800 yards from shore. Marines would wade through the killing zone he'd designed. Every machine gun would fire into packed ranks of men struggling through water, carrying 60-pound packs. The reef was mathematically perfect. Americans died in the water, or they didn't land at all. Shibasaki descended into his command bunker on the evening of November 19th, listening to reconnaissance reports of the American fleet 12 miles offshore. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, thousands of Marines. It didn't matter. Surface bombardment might destroy some positions, but his bunkers were designed to survive. The fortifications would hold. And when the first landing craft hit the reef in 3 feet of water instead of 5, when Marines climbed over the sides and began their long wade through the killing zone, his machine gunners would prove his mathematics correct. What Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had never calculated was the possibility of vehicles that didn't need 4 feet of water. Tracked machines that swam at 6 miles per hour and climbed coral barriers. Amphibious tractors that could cross his perfect reef in 8 minutes instead of 30. 125 steel crocodiles that would deliver 1,500 Marines directly onto his beaches before his carefully designed kill zone could function. At 0300 hours, November 20th, 1943, American pre-invasion bombardment began. 3 battleships and 4 cruisers hammered Betio with more than 3,000 tons of high-explosive shells. The island disappeared beneath smoke and flame, surface positions shattered, palm trees disintegrated. But 4 feet of reinforced concrete held. Shibasaki's bunkers survived. When the guns fell silent at 0825, Japanese defenders emerged from underground shelters, returned to firing positions, and loaded their weapons. At 0910, the first wave crossed the line of departure. 125 LVTs churned toward Red Beach 1, Red Beach 2, and Red Beach 3. Behind them, conventional Higgins boats carried follow-on waves. And in Pillbox 47, Corporal Tadao Onuki watched vehicles swimming through water that should have stopped them and realized that Admiral Shibasaki's mathematics had one critical flaw. Each hour was scheduled for 0830. The first LVT crossed the line of departure at 0900, 30 minutes late. Coordination delays had cascaded through the task force. Battleships and cruisers had hammered Betio since 0300, but carrier aircraft scheduled to maintain continuous bombing until the last moment couldn't coordinate with naval gunfire. The bombardment paused. Aircraft struck. Naval fire resumed. Timing slipped. Aboard the transport ships, Marines loaded into LVTs and Higgins boats waited in the assembly areas, circling in formation while staff officers adjusted the schedule. Dawn light strengthened. The element of surprise, already compromised by 3 hours of bombardment, evaporated completely. Japanese defenders emerged from bunkers, returned to firing positions, and watched the American Armada prepare its assault. At 0900, Major Henry C. Drews gave the signal. 125 LVTs accelerated toward Betio in 3 waves, targeting Red Beach 1, Red Beach 2, and Red Beach 3. Each LVT carried 20 to 24 combat-loaded Marines, rifles, ammunition, 60-pound packs, grenades, demolition charges, water. The Continental W970-9A engines roared at 250 horsepower, pushing the 15-ton vehicles through calm morning water at 6 miles per hour. Behind them, the second and third waves followed in conventional LCVP Higgins boats. Each Higgins boat carried 36 Marines and could reach 12 knots, faster than the LVTs, but required deeper water to operate. Navy coxswains checked their tide tables. 5 feet of water over the reef. Plenty of clearance for the 3-foot aft draft and 2-foot 2-inch forward draft. The mathematics worked. Except Major Frank Holland's warning about dodging tides had been accurate. At 0920, 500 yards from shore, the first Higgins boat struck coral with a grinding crunch that every Marine aboard felt through the hull. The coxswain threw the engine into reverse. The propeller churned water. The boat didn't move. Wedged on coral, 800 yards from Red Beach 2, the LCVP sat motionless while machine gun fire began walking toward it from Japanese positions. Within 60 seconds, a dozen more Higgins boats ground onto the reef across a 1,000-yard front. Water depth, 3 feet. The tide tables had been wrong, or rather the unpredictable neap tide had dropped water levels by exactly the 2 feet that made landing impossible for conventional craft. Marines aboard the stranded Higgins boats faced a simple, terrible choice: stay aboard vessels that couldn't move while Japanese gunners adjusted range, or climb over the sides and wade. They waded. 300 yards, 500 yards, 800 yards, depending on where their boat had grounded. Chest-deep water for most men. Neck-deep for shorter Marines. 60-pound packs dragging them down. Rifles held overhead to keep actions dry. No cover. No concealment. Type 92 machine guns, firing 450 rounds per minute, opened up from prepared positions. Type 93 13mm heavy machine guns added 475 rounds per minute. The carefully designed kill zone that Rear Admiral Shibasaki had calculated functioned exactly as planned. Marines fell. Wounded men drowned under the weight of their equipment. Bodies floated in water that turned red. Robert Sherrod, a war correspondent with Time Life who had volunteered to go ashore with the assault waves, watched from a stranded Higgins boat. "I watched them wade in and die. The water never got below their waists, and the machine guns were working on them continuously. The wading Marines took 30 minutes to cover 500 yards. Casualty rates exceeded 50% before reaching the log seawall. Those who made it arrived scattered, exhausted, separated from their units with wet ammunition and lost equipment. Unit cohesion, the fundamental requirement for assault infantry, had been destroyed by the Reef. But the LVTs had never stopped. At 0910, 10 minutes ahead of the Higgins boats, the first wave of amphibious tractors reached the coral reef barrier. Water depth dropped to 3 feet. The paddle tracks that drove the LVTs through water like swimming crocodiles bit into coral and kept churning. Speed dropped slightly, 6 miles per hour in open water, 5 on the reef, but forward momentum never stopped. Japanese gunners shifted fire from the stranded Higgins boats to these unexpected machines. 8-inch coastal guns tracked the slow-moving targets. Type 93 13mm rounds perforated thin steel hulls. The first LVT took a direct hit and exploded, Marines jumping into water as flames consumed the vehicle. A second LVT ground to a halt, tracks damaged by coral, dead in the water 300 yards from shore. A third kept moving with smoke pouring from its engine compartment until it reached the beach and delivered its Marines before the crew abandoned it. The crossing took 8 minutes. 8 minutes versus 30 for wading Marines. 8 minutes of continuous fire from every Japanese weapon that could bear, but 8 minutes delivered 1,500 Marines to 3 beaches in the first wave. Private First Class Newman M. Baird, manning a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on his LVT's improvised pedestal, recalled, "We were 100 yards in now, and the enemy fire was awful damn intense and getting worse. They were knocking tractors out left and right. A tractor'd get hit, stop, and burst into flames, with men jumping out like torches." At 0918, the first LVT reached Red Beach 1, climbed the coral shelf, and drove straight over the 4-foot log seawall that Japanese engineers had built to stop landing craft. The tracked vehicle that Rear Admiral Shibasaki had never calculated rolled across his defensive barrier, stopped 20 yards inland, and discharged 24 Marines directly onto Betio. They hit the ground combat-ready, weapons dry, unit intact, and immediately engaged the nearest pillbox. By 0930, the first wave had delivered 1,500 Marines to shore, but 75% of the LVTs in that wave had been hit. Burning vehicles littered the reef. Major Drews, coordinating from shore, counted operational tractors and calculated grim mathematics: 125 LVTs at mission start, minus casualties, equals not enough vehicles to bring the second and third waves across the reef in time. The LVTs that survived turned around and went back through the fire. The surviving LVTs had no choice but to return through the killing zone because 15,000 Marines still waited offshore. Between 0930 and 1200, the remaining operational amphibious tractors executed a shuttle mission under continuous fire. Drive to the reef line, pick up Marines from stranded Higgins boats or directly from transport ships. Run the gauntlet across 500 to 800 yards of coral, while Japanese gunners adjusted for range and deflection, discharged troops on the beach, load wounded for evacuation, and repeat. Every crossing meant 8 minutes under fire from positions that had been pre-sighted for exactly this scenario. Except Rear Admiral Shibasaki had calculated for Marines wading at 2 miles per hour. The LVTs crossed at 6 miles per hour, 3 times faster, but still slow enough that every weapon on Betio could track them. Major Henry C. Drews coordinated the shuttle from a hastily established command post behind the log seawall on Red Beach 2. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion had started the morning with 125 vehicles. By 1000, Drews counted 70 operational. By 1100, 55. The mathematics were straightforward and catastrophic. At current attrition rates, the battalion would run out of functional LVTs by mid-afternoon. Without amphibious tractors, the invasion would stall with half the assault force still offshore, and the Marines already landed running out of ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Drews pushed his crews harder, shorter intervals between runs, less time for maintenance. Damaged vehicles kept running until they died completely. The thin steel hulls that had been adequate for carrying cargo to undefended beaches proved devastatingly vulnerable under combat conditions. Type 92 7.7mm machine gun rounds, designed to penetrate aircraft aluminum, punched through the quarter-inch hull plates as if they were cardboard. The improvised 3/8-inch boilerplate welded to cabs in Samoa protected drivers from small arms, but nothing heavier. Type 93 13mm heavy machine guns perforated both hull and cab armor. The 8-inch coastal guns didn't bother with precision. A near miss from a 200-pound shell would flip an LVT, crush the hull, or blow the tracks off. Direct hits vaporized vehicles and everyone aboard. Private First Class Newman M. Baird, manning the .50 caliber machine gun on his LVT during the second shuttle run at 10:15, watched the vehicle ahead of his take a direct hit. The explosion just lifted it out of the water. 1 second it was there, the next it was pieces. I saw a Marine fly through the air, still holding his rifle. Then we drove through where it had been, and there was just debris and bodies floating. The crews kept driving. Corporal John Spillane, LVT driver with the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, made 4 round trips across the reef between 0930 and 1300. His vehicle took 17 separate hits, 12 from machine gun fire, 5 from what he believed were 37mm anti-tank guns. The engine compartment caught fire on the 3rd trip. His crew extinguished it with seawater and kept driving. On the 4th trip, the left track was damaged by coral and began throwing links. Spillane drove the crippled vehicle to shore, discharged his Marines, loaded 6 wounded for evacuation, and made it halfway back to the reef line before the track failed completely. He and his crew abandoned the LVT and swam to a stranded Higgins boat. By noon, 35 LVTs remained operational out of 125, a 72% casualty rate. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion had suffered 100 casualties, 32 killed, 68 missing, and presumed dead. Major Drews had been killed coordinating traffic on Red Beach 2 when Japanese artillery found his command post. Command passed to Captain Henry Chamberlain, who continued the shuttle with the vehicles that still functioned. The mathematics of survival proved brutal but effective. 1,500 Marines landed via LVT in the first wave, arrived combat-ready in 10 minutes with unit cohesion intact. Marines who waded from stranded Higgins boats took 30 minutes, suffered 50% casualties, and arrived scattered, exhausted, and disorganized. The difference between success and catastrophe was measured in crossing time and vehicle protection. 8 minutes in a thin steel box versus 30 minutes wading chest deep. Both routes were lethal, but one delivered troops capable of fighting. At 13:30, Colonel David M. Shoup came ashore in a damaged LVT that barely made the crossing. The vehicle had taken hits to the engine compartment and was leaking fuel, but the crew drove it to Red Beach 2, grounded it on coral, and discharged Shoup and his command staff before abandoning it to the rising tide. Shoup, commanding officer of the 2nd Marines Regiment, had been wounded by shrapnel during the approach. His leg bled through makeshift bandages. He ignored it, established a regimental command post in a shell hole behind the seawall, and sent his first situation report to Major General Julian C. Smith aboard the USS Maryland. Casualties many. Percentage of dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Shoup's assessment was accurate. The beachhead held. 3,000 Marines had made it ashore by 1400, most of them via the surviving LVTs. They held a perimeter 300 yards deep in the center, less at the flanks. Japanese counterattacks had been repelled. Ammunition was short. Water was critical. Medical supplies were running out, but the Marines held ground on Betio, and more LVTs, battered, damaged, barely functional, kept bringing reinforcements and supplies across the reef that Rear Admiral Shibasaki had believed would stop everything. By 1800, when the first day of fighting ended, only 35 LVTs remained operational. Burning wrecks littered the reef from Red Beach 1 to Red Beach 3. Bodies floated in the shallows, Marines who'd jumped from flaming vehicles, LVT crews who'd been caught by machine gun fire, wounded men who'd drowned waiting for evacuation. The coral barrier that was supposed to be Shibasaki's perfect defensive asset had been crossed. The cost had been 90 amphibious tractors and 100 men from the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion. But the LVTs had proven something no military planner had been certain of before November 20th, 1943. Tracked vehicles could swim under fire, cross barriers that stopped conventional landing craft, and deliver troops to fortified beaches. The concept worked. The technology worked. Even as they burned, the surviving 35 LVTs would continue the shuttle for 2 more days, bringing ammunition and water forward, evacuating wounded to hospital ships, and proving that Donald Roebling's Hurricane rescue vehicle had become the weapon that would define amphibious warfare for the rest of the Pacific War. The beachhead Colonel David M. Shoup commanded on the evening of November 20th measured 300 yards deep at the strongest point, less than 100 yards at the weakest. 3,000 Marines held a perimeter that Japanese artillery could hit from any direction. Ammunition was critically short, many positions down to their last magazines. Water was worse. The tropical heat and exertion of combat had men drinking salt water in desperation. Medical supplies had run out by 1,500 hours, leaving corpsmen treating sucking chest wounds with nothing but pressure bandages and morphine. The 35 surviving LVTs shuttled supplies forward when they could, but Japanese fire made daylight crossings suicide missions. Most supplies came after dark, delivered by Marines wading from Higgins boats, grounded on the reef, carrying ammunition boxes and water cans across 500 yards of coral and floating bodies. Shoup, wounded and commanding from a shell hole that served as regimental headquarters, sent hourly situation reports to Major General Julian C. Smith aboard the USS Maryland. Time 05s, his most famous, came at 15:45 hours, casualties many. Percentage of dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. It was defiant optimism built on brutal mathematics. The Marines held ground. They'd stopped Japanese counterattacks. Reinforcements were landing. The beachhead would hold through the night. But winning meant calculating how many more Marines would die before Betio was secure. The night of November 20th to 21st brought desperate fighting. Japanese infantry launched 3 separate counterattacks designed to throw the Marines back into the ocean. They came at midnight, at 0200 hours, and at 0400 hours, waves of screaming troops charging positions illuminated by parachute flares dropped from offshore destroyers. Marines with rifles, machine guns, and grenades broke each assault. Bodies piled in front of defensive positions. By dawn, 400 Japanese dead lay in the perimeter. American casualties, 83 killed, 200 wounded. The mathematics favored the defenders, but attrition was destroying both sides. November 21st brought reinforcements and renewed offensive action. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines landed via the remaining LVTs and surviving Higgins boats, bringing fresh troops and critical supplies. Shoup organized attacks against the Japanese strongpoints that had held through the first day. Progress was measured in yards. Each pillbox required flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close assault by Marines who advanced under covering fire from machine guns and rifles. Bunkers with 4 feet of reinforced concrete absorbed multiple satchel charges before collapsing. The interconnected trench systems allowed Japanese defenders to reinforce threatened positions from underground passages. When Marines cleared one bunker, fire erupted from the next. The island's defenders fought exactly as Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had ordered: defend to the last man, destroy the enemy at the water's edge, or die trying. Shibasaki himself died on November 21st or 22nd. The exact circumstances remained unclear. Some reports indicated he was killed in his command bunker by naval gunfire. Others suggested he died leading a counterattack. What was clear, command and control among Japanese forces degraded throughout November 21st. Radio communications ceased. Organized counterattacks gave way to desperate local actions. Individual positions fought in isolation as Marines systematically reduced the fortress Shibasaki had spent 18 months building. November 22nd brought the final push. The 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines landed and joined the attack eastward along the island's length. Marines advanced using the tactics they'd learned at brutal cost. Tanks led, infantry followed under covering fire, flamethrowers burned defenders from bunkers, demolitions sealed positions. The advance covered 600 yards, half the remaining Japanese-held territory. Organized resistance was collapsing, but isolated positions continued fighting. Japanese troops in bypassed bunkers emerged at night to attack Marine positions from behind. Some positions fought for 3 days, defended by troops with no water, no food, no hope of relief or rescue, but absolute determination to kill more Americans before dying. Colonel David M. Shoup received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the battle. The citation detailed his leadership. Although severely shocked by an exploding shell soon after landing at the pier, Colonel Shoup rallied his hesitant troops and, by his inspiring leadership, contempt of personal danger, and indomitable determination, succeeded in preventing the disaster which the situation threatened. He fearlessly exposed himself to the terrific, relentless artillery, machine gun, and rifle fire from hostile shore emplacements. Constantly exposing himself, he maintained vigorous supervision, rallying his hesitant troops, reorganizing them, eliminating confusion, and pressing forward the attack. At 13:30 hours, November 23, 1943, Major General Julian C. Smith declared Betio secure. The battle had lasted 76 hours from first landing to final victory. The mathematics of victory were written in blood. American casualties: 997 Marines killed in action, 88 missing and presumed dead, 2,233 wounded. Total 3,407 casualties out of 12,000 Marines who fought on Betio, a 28% casualty rate. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion suffered 100 casualties, 32 killed, 68 missing, out of a battalion strength of approximately 400 men. 90 LVTs destroyed or disabled out of 125 committed. Japanese casualties: 4,690 killed out of 4,836 defenders. Only 17 Japanese combat troops survived as prisoners. 146 Korean laborers surrendered. The Japanese garrison had been annihilated. War correspondent Robert Sherrod, who'd waded ashore on November 20th and remained through the battle, wrote the description that defined Tarawa for Americans: "Words are inadequate to describe what I saw on this island of less than a square mile. So are pictures. You can't smell pictures." The smell was death. 6,000 bodies decomposing in tropical heat, blood-soaked sand, burning fuel from destroyed vehicles, cordite, salt water. The smell stayed with veterans for decades. But beneath the horror, military planners saw validation. The LVTs had worked. Tarawa would have been impossible without amphibious tractors. The 72% vehicle loss rate was acceptable because the mission succeeded. Without LVTs, the Higgins boats would have grounded, Marines would have waded, casualties would have been catastrophic, and the invasion would have failed. The tactical revolution that began with Donald Roebling's Hurricane rescue vehicle had been proven in blood at Betio Island. Now the question was, Could American industry produce enough LVTs to win the Pacific War? The answer to whether American industry could produce enough LVTs came quickly, yes, and in numbers that would have seemed impossible before Tarawa. November 24th, 1943, Keats. Engineers bulldozed Japanese fortifications on Betio, while graves registration teams collected bodies and war correspondents filed dispatches that shocked the American public. Photographs of dead Marines floating in Tarawa's lagoon appeared in newspapers nationwide. The casualty figures, 3,407 in 76 hours, triggered questions in Congress and editorials demanding explanations. Was this tiny island worth nearly 1,000 American lives? Military planners studying after-action reports reached a different conclusion. Tarawa proved amphibious assault against fortified positions was possible, but only with the right equipment. The LVT had transformed from experimental technology to essential weapon. The post-battle analysis was brutal and precise. Lieutenant General Holland Smith's earlier warning, "No LVTs, no operation," had been prophetic. Marines who landed via amphibious tractor in the first wave suffered approximately 15% casualties but arrived combat-ready with unit cohesion intact. Marines who waded from stranded Higgins boats suffered 50% casualties and arrived scattered, exhausted, disorganized. The mathematics proved that 8 minutes crossing time in armored vehicles versus 30 minutes wading made the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The 72% LVT loss rate, 90 vehicles destroyed out of 125, was acceptable because the mission succeeded. Without amphibious tractors, the invasion would have failed completely. American industry responded with characteristic efficiency. Production of LVTs, which had been modest through 1943, expanded dramatically. New variants appeared addressing the lessons learned at Tarawa. The LVT-A1 mounted a 37mm gun in a turret, providing direct fire support during beach assaults. The LVT-4 featured a rear ramp, allowing faster troop discharge and the ability to carry vehicles. Armor protection improved from improvised boilerplate to factory-installed steel capable of stopping machine gun fire and shell fragments. By 1945, more than 18,000 LVTs of all variants had been produced, from Donald Roebling's original 200 civilian rescue vehicles to an industrial fleet that equipped every Marine division in the Pacific. The tactical doctrine pioneered at Tarawa became standard for every subsequent amphibious operation. Saipan in June 1944, 700 LVTs landed the assault waves. Guam in July 1944, LVTs crossed coral reefs that would have stopped conventional landing craft. Peleliu in September 1944, amphibious tractors delivered Marines directly to fortified beaches. Iwo Jima in February 1945, 800 LVTs, many with armor and turrets, crossed volcanic sand beaches under fire. Okinawa in April 1945, the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history, employed more than 1,000 LVTs. What had shocked Corporal Tadao Onuki at Tarawa, tracked vehicles swimming through ocean water, became so routine by 1945 that Marine Corps doctrine assumed LVT availability for any contested landing. Time 0.5s, the Japanese never developed an effective countermeasure. Their defensive doctrine, perfected over 18 months at Betio, assumed reef barriers would stop landing craft and force attackers to wade. Swimming tanks invalidated that assumption. Subsequent Japanese fortifications incorporated deeper beach defenses and more extensive underground positions, but they never solved the fundamental problem. LVTs could cross barriers that stopped conventional boats. The technological surprise that Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki never calculated shortened the Pacific War by enabling the rapid island-hopping campaign that brought American forces within striking distance of Japan by mid-1945. The human cost of proving the concept remained. Major Henry C. Drews, killed coordinating LVT traffic on Red Beach 2, was posthumously honored. Camp Henry C. Drews at Marine Corps Base Quantico memorializes his leadership of the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion. The 32 killed and 68 missing from his battalion paid the price for tactical lessons that saved thousands of lives in subsequent operations. Colonel David M. Shoup received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the 76 hours of combat, wounded but refusing evacuation, rallying troops, reorganizing scattered units, and maintaining offensive momentum when the situation threatened disaster. Today, the modern AAV-7 amphibious assault vehicle used by the United States Marine Corps traces its lineage directly to Donald Roebling's 1935 Alligator. The tracked vehicle that swims at 6 miles per hour through water and operates on land remains the doctrinal foundation for amphibious warfare 80 years after Tarawa. Betio Island, now part of the Republic of Kiribati, preserves the rusting 8-inch coastal guns, concrete bunkers, and hulls of LVTs still visible in the reef at low tide. Memorials commemorate the fallen American and Japanese who fought for less than 1 square mile of coral. The tactical revolution that began November 20th, 1943, proved Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki fundamentally wrong about 2 things. First, 1 million men weren't needed. 18,000 Marines took Betio in 76 hours. Second, and more critically, his perfect defensive mathematics assumed landing craft that needed 4 feet of water. He never calculated for vehicles that needed only 3 feet because they swam on tracks instead of floating on hulls. Corporal Tadao Onuki, firing his Type 93 13mm machine gun from Pillbox 47, had asked the right question that November morning: how many bullets would it take to stop swimming steel? The answer was more bullets than he had, more than the fortress had, more than the mathematics allowed. Because Donald Roebling had designed a hurricane rescue vehicle for the Florida Everglades, and the United States Marine Corps had turned it into the weapon that won the Pacific War. The LVTs crossed Tarawa's Reef. Japan never saw them coming, and the impossible became routine.